Well, months of violence and unrest in Venezuela has reached a critical point as President Nicolas Maduro celebrates an election that's been roundly criticized internationally for reversing democracy. That measure creates a new assembly of Maduro loyalists who are expected to rewrite the constitution. At least 10 people were killed Sunday during anti-election protests. The opposition says the vote was fraudulent and is calling for further demonstrations. Well, Christopher Sabatini focuses on Latin America as a professor at Columbia University. He joins us now from New York. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Linda.
Chris, for months we've seen these deadly clashes between protesters and police, and now a vote that will let the president rewrite the constitution. Can Venezuela's isolation from the world get worse?
It's hard to imagine that it could. The governments of Spain, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Mexico all said that if the government went ahead with this vote, they would not recognize it. Now, we don't know what that means, but it does mean that clearly the neighbors in large parts of the Spanish-speaking world will not recognize the vote. And this was not a vote, it's important to note. No one asked the people of Venezuela whether they wanted a new constitution. This vote was to elect a new assembly to write a new constitution, whether they wanted to or not. And according to surveys, between 75 to 80% of Venezuelans did not want a new constitution. So they're isolated not only internationally, but this government's isolated domestically. It's important to note, though, he is welcome somewhere right now, or at least a little while ago. President Maduro was in North Korea. Being recognized. So at least he has one ally in the world right now.
We know there are 19 million registered voters, people that could have voted. And as you mentioned, the polls showed that 70% of people didn't want to vote, or certainly didn't want to support this vote. Can we believe the president when he says the turnout was high?
No. In this case, we're talking the Venezuela president, of course. And what we really can't. I mean, first of all, this is an electoral commission that has been packed with loyalists, that has engaged in already very suspicious and basically disqualified 3 legislators of the National Assembly, denying the opposition under very shady, questionable allegations that deny the National Assembly, the opposition, the National Assembly, a supermajority. According to most reports, the lines in the voting booth were very, very short. And now they claim that about 8 million people voted when no one wanted the assembly to begin with. The only list of candidates were pro-government candidates. The opposition boycotted it. It stretches credulity to believe that 8 million people in Venezuela, a country in which there's 80% poverty and in which inflation is running at 1,000%, would have turned out to vote in favor of a constituent assembly in numbers of 8 million people. And again, it's rather silly, too, that they would lie to such an extent. They have the entire government pretty much packed. There are only government supporters on the ticket. It's kind of like cheating in solitaire.
You mentioned a lot of Venezuela's neighboring countries have dismissed this election, as has the U.S. We know that the U.S. is considering new sanctions. Do you think they will be enforced soon? And what other countries could carry out some action? What could we see happen?
Well, here, Linda, the trick is really what type of sanctions the U.S. employs. It has already employed over 20 individual sanctions on people within the government, including the vice president, over issues of narcotics trafficking, corruption, human rights abuses. That's basically denied them their visas to travel to the United States and frozen their U.S. bank accounts. Now the White House is considering something much more serious and potentially dangerous. One of the things that's been floated is the idea of a complete U.S. embargo on Venezuelan oil. Venezuela sends about 700,000 barrels of oil to the United States to be refined. It also depends on U.S. oil to lighten its crude, as was mentioned in the previous segment. And Venezuela depends on 95% of its exports on oil. So if the U.S. government did this, it would have devastating consequences, but not on the government per se, because basically this is a government that represses at will. It would really affect the people and could really have a damaging consequence on the opposition. Basically, for now, people blame the government for the severe economic distress the country's in. If the U.S., which the government has claimed is behind the opposition, suddenly imposes pain on the Venezuelan people by shutting off its main source of revenue, the opposition will take the blame. And that could have very devastating consequences on the path forward for this country.
So if the sanctions are only going to hurt the people already suffering there, what else can be done?
I think the most important thing, Linda, is that other countries step up and impose their own sanctions along the lines of the sanctions that the U.S. has already imposed. Those would include diplomatic isolation, economic freezing of bank accounts, for example. Despite all of the rhetoric and the bluster of this government, it really does care about international recognition and legitimacy. It does often like to point to the fact that it's had more elections than most other countries. It likes to point out to the fact that it has reduced poverty, although that's no longer true. If other countries start to sort of collectively encircle it, and we've seen this in other cases too, in Bosnia, in South Africa, where basically international pressure collectively applied can bring the party to the negotiating table and bring real reform. But unless the other communities do that, other countries do that, the U.S. going it alone, especially in the way it's been hinting it could do, would actually cause more havoc and actually, I think, be a step backward.
All right, Christopher Sabatini from Columbia University. Good to get perspective from you. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Lynda.